December 10, 1944. Stalag Luft Three, somewhere in the frozen heart of Silesia. Oberleutnant Klaus Hoffmann stood in the roll call line, his breath clouding in the bitter morning air. His Luftwaffe uniform, once pristine and pressed with Prussian precision, hung loose on his frame. 6 months of captivity had carved away the weight, leaving only angles and hollows. But it was not the hunger that kept him awake at night. It was the waiting. The Americans had told him something impossible. They had said it with the casual confidence of men who did not understand that such things could not be true. Red Cross parcels, the camp interpreter had announced 3 days ago. Coming this week. Klaus had nodded politely, the way one nods at a madman. In the barracks that night, the other pilots had laughed, not with joy, but with the bitter humour of men who had learned that hope was the cruelest weapon of all. "They think we are fools," Hauptmann Werner Schroeder had muttered, from his bunk. Werner was older, 40 perhaps, with the Iron Cross pinned above his heart and eyes that had seen too much sky turn to flame. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. They feed us sawdust bread and call it mercy. Now they promise gifts. American propaganda. Like everything else. Klaus wanted to believe Werner. It would be easier that way, easier than the alternative, easier than considering that everything they had been taught about the enemy might have been a carefully constructed lie. Because if the Americans were monsters, if they were the savage barbarians that Goebbels had described in those pre-flight briefings, then captivity made sense. It was simply war's mathematics. Cruelty answered with cruelty. Strength defeating weakness. But if the Americans were something else entirely, if they possessed some quality that the Reich had insisted did not exist beyond German borders, then what did that make Klaus? What did it make the war? The guard tower's spotlight swept across the compound, mechanical and indifferent. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle screamed through the December cold. Klaus closed his eyes and remembered the briefing room in Dusseldorf, 2 years ago, when the world still made sense. The intelligence officer had been younger than Klaus, perhaps 23, with the kind of face that had never questioned an order. He had stood before a wall map of Europe, the territories marked in confident red, and spoken with the certainty of scripture. "The Americans," he had said, tapping his pointer against the western edge of the map, "are a mongrel nation, weak, undisciplined. They have no warrior spirit, no understanding of sacrifice. Their soldiers are farm boys and factory workers playing at war. If you are shot down over American lines, expect no mercy. They do not understand honor. They will interrogate you with cruelty, starve you, work you until your body breaks." The room had been silent except for the scratch of pencils on paper as the young pilots took notes. Klaus had written it all down in neat script, believing every word. Because why would the Reich lie? The Reich had given him wings. The Reich had made him into something more than the baker's son from Stuttgart. The Reich had promised that if he fought bravely, if he held the line against the Allied bombers, Germany would endure for 1,000 years. That promise felt very far away now, here in the cold mud of Stalag Luft Three, where the only thing that endured was hunger and the endless counting of days. The camp was vast, larger than Klaus had imagined a prison could be. Row after row of wooden barracks stretched behind double fences of barbed wire, watchtowers at each corner manned by American guards who looked barely old enough to shave. Beyond the wire, the Polish countryside rolled away into winter grey, fields frozen hard as iron, forests dark and still. It was a landscape that swallowed hope. The Luftwaffe had built its doctrine on a simple principle. Airmen were elite. They were not common soldiers to be thrown into trenches and forgotten. They were educated men, technicians of death who understood physics and navigation, who could read the sky like scholars read Latin. When Hermann Göring had established the Luftwaffe's prison camp system in 1940, he had done so with a strange kind of pride. Stalag Lufts would be different. They would be administered by the Luftwaffe itself, not the Wehrmacht, not the SS. They would follow the Geneva Convention to the letter because Göring wanted the same courtesy extended to his pilots when they fell into enemy hands. It was a practical calculation dressed up as honor. Klaus understood this now. The Luftwaffe protected its own, not out of nobility, but out of fear. Fear that the Allies would retaliate, fear that captured German pilots would suffer, fear that the propaganda value of civilized German camps would be lost. But the Americans, Klaus had been told, operated under no such constraints. They had signed the Geneva Convention, yes, but what did signatures matter to a nation of barbarians? The first shock had come on his third day in the camp. Klaus had been sitting on his bunk, still disoriented from the interrogation at Stalag Luft, when an American sergeant had appeared in the barracks doorway. The man was enormous, taller than any German Klaus had ever seen, with shoulders that seemed to fill the entire frame. Klaus had tensed, waiting for violence. Instead, the sergeant had smiled. "Name's Miller," he had said in fractured German. "You need blankets?" Klaus had stared. The sergeant had gestured toward the supply room. "Blankets. For cold. You understand?" When Klaus had finally nodded, Miller had brought him 2 wool blankets, grey and worn but clean, and handed them over without ceremony. "Sleep good," he had said, and left. Klaus had sat on his bunk for a long time after that, holding the blankets in his hands, trying to reconcile this simple act of humanity with everything he knew to be true about Americans. Werner had noticed his confusion. "Theatre," the older pilot had said from across the room. "They want us soft, compliant. The cruelty comes later. It always does." But days had passed, then weeks, and the cruelty had not come. The food was meagre, true. Breakfast consisted of weak coffee and a slice of bread that tasted faintly of sawdust. Lunch was soup so thin you could read through it, made from potatoes and barley, and sometimes a few scraps of meat that might have been horse meat or might have been anything. Dinner was more bread, more soup, the same cycle grinding on. Klaus had lost weight. They all had, their uniforms hanging like sacks on frames that grew more skeletal with each passing week. But no one was beaten. No one was tortured. The guards were young and bored, more interested in trading cigarettes with the prisoners than enforcing harsh discipline. The camp had a library, donated by the YMCA, filled with books in English and German. There was a small theatre where prisoners put on shows, crude comedies and musicals performed with whatever props they could scrounge. There were organised sports in the yard on days when the weather allowed, football matches that drew crowds of spectators from both sides of the wire. It was, Klaus thought, the strangest prison he could have imagined. Not cruel, not kind, just bureaucratically indifferent, as though the Americans had read the Geneva Convention and decided that following it to the letter required no emotion at all. They processed prisoners like paperwork: name, rank, serial number, medical check, bunk assignment, meal schedule, work detail if you were enlisted, idle boredom if you were an officer. The machinery of captivity turned with mechanical precision, and somehow that was more disturbing than brutality would have been. Because brutality, Klaus understood. Brutality fit the narrative, but this strange, dispassionate efficiency suggested something that terrified him more than hatred ever could. It suggested that the Americans simply did not care enough to hate, that they had so much, so many men and so many resources that German prisoners were just another logistical problem to be managed and filed away. Werner had been in the camp longer than Klaus. He had seen the first Red Cross parcel distribution in the spring of 1943, carried in on a truck from Switzerland via a long chain of neutral territory and bureaucratic miracles. The Americans had lined up the prisoners and explained the system through translators. Each man would receive 1 parcel per week, assuming the supply lines held. The parcels were gifts from the International Red Cross, assembled in America and shipped across the Atlantic to help sustain prisoners of war. He had described it to Klaus one night, his voice heavy with something that might have been wonder or might have been shame. They opened the crates, Werner had said, and inside were these boxes, maybe this big. He had held his hands apart to indicate a size roughly 12 inches square. The American sergeant called out names, and men stepped forward to receive them. And Klaus, when they opened those boxes, when they saw what was inside, He had trailed off, staring at the ceiling of the barracks as though the answer might be written there. Some men cried. Others laughed like madmen. Because it was food, Klaus. Real food. Not just bread, not just soup, spam and sardines and powdered milk and chocolate. Chocolate, Klaus. When was the last time you had chocolate? Klaus had not answered because the answer was too painful. Chocolate had disappeared from Germany in 1942, requisitioned for soldiers at the front, and even soldiers rarely saw it. Chocolate was a memory from before the war, a taste of childhood that had been swallowed by rationing and scarcity. And cigarettes, Werner had continued. 5 packs per box. American cigarettes, Lucky Strike, and Chesterfield, the kind you see in propaganda posters about American decadence. The guards told us we could keep them, trade them, do whatever we wanted. They said it was ours. The supply had been irregular at first. Sometimes weeks would pass between distributions. The parcels came from Geneva, transported across a continent at war, delayed by bombed rail lines and shifting front lines, and the chaos of a world tearing itself apart. But when they came, they changed everything. Men who had been hollow-eyed and listless would brighten at the sight of a Red Cross truck. The packages became currency, a shadow economy where cigarettes could buy extra rations from the German guards, where coffee could be traded for news from home. Klaus had not been in the camp long enough to receive a parcel before the supply had dried up completely in the autumn of 1944. The Ardennes offensive had cut supply lines. The Reich's infrastructure, already crumbling under Allied bombing, could not guarantee safe passage even for neutral Red Cross trucks. The prisoners had gone back to living on German rations alone, and the hunger had returned with a vengeance. Now, on this cold December morning, the Americans were saying the parcels were coming back. Klaus wanted to believe it the way a drowning man wants to believe in shore. But belief required trust, and trust was a luxury he could not afford. The roll call ended. The prisoners dispersed to their various routines, some to work details, others to the endless waiting that defined officer life. Klaus returned to his barracks, a long wooden building divided into rooms that held 8 men each. His roommates were a cross-section of the Luftwaffe's defeat. There was Werner, the old Hauptmann with his iron cross and his bitter wisdom. There was Friedrich, 20 years old and shot down on his 3rd mission, who still could not quite accept that the war had continued without him. There was Otto, a navigator from Hamburg who spent his days sketching maps of places he would never see again. And there were others, each carrying their own private grief, their own quiet rage at the injustice of being alive while better men had died. They gathered in the center of the room, sitting on bunks or leaning against the walls, and tried to make sense of what was coming. "It is a test," Friedrich said. His voice had the high, anxious quality of youth trying to sound certain. "They want to see how we react. If we accept their charity, they will use it against us somehow." Otto shook his head. "A test of what? We are prisoners. We have no power, no leverage. What could they possibly gain from testing us?" "Information," Werner said quietly. "They give us food. We grow complacent. We talk more freely. We forget operational security. It is a classic interrogation technique. Make the prisoner comfortable, and he will tell you anything." Klaus listened, but said nothing. In his heart, he knew they were rationalizing, constructing elaborate theories to avoid confronting a simpler truth. The Americans were giving them food because they could. Because they had so much that feeding even their enemies was a trivial expense. Because the industrial might of a nation that had never known invasion, never felt the boot of occupation, could afford to be generous in a way Germany never could. That thought should have filled him with despair. Instead, it filled him with something more dangerous: curiosity. The truck arrived just after lunch on December 14th, 1944. Klaus was in the yard when he heard the engine, a low diesel rumble that cut through the winter silence. Men stopped what they were doing, football games pausing mid-kick, conversations trailing off into watchful quiet. The truck rolled through the main gate, American markings clear on its canvas side, and came to a stop near the administration building. The camp commander, a Luftwaffe Oberst named Braun, who looked perpetually exhausted by the weight of his impossible job, emerged to meet the American liaison officer. They spoke briefly, Brown nodding, the American gesturing toward the truck bed. Then Braun turned and called out in German, "All prisoners to the assembly area. Parcel distribution in 10 minutes." The yard erupted. Men surged toward the assembly area, a flat stretch of packed dirt between the barracks and the fence. Klaus found himself caught in the current, swept along by bodies and hope, and the terrible fear that this might all be another cruel joke. He positioned himself near the front, next to Werner, and waited. American guards began unloading crates from the truck. Wooden crates, heavy and solid, stamped with red crosses that seemed to glow in the pale winter light. They stacked them in rows, methodical and efficient, while a sergeant with a clipboard conferred with Oberst Braun. Finally, the sergeant stepped forward and spoke through the camp interpreter. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd, "the International Committee of the Red Cross has arranged for the delivery of food parcels to this camp. Each prisoner will receive one parcel. These parcels are a gift, provided in accordance with the Geneva Convention. You are not required to share them, but we encourage pooling resources for communal meals if you choose." He paused, consulting his clipboard. "When I call your name, step forward to receive your parcel. Do not open it until all prisoners have received theirs. Is that understood?" A murmur of acknowledgement rippled through the crowd. Klaus felt his pulse quicken. His hands were shaking. He clenched them into fists and told himself it meant nothing. It was just food, just another tool of American manipulation. But his body betrayed him, his mouth watering at the promise of something, anything, beyond sawdust, bread, and watery soup. The sergeant began calling names. One by one, prisoners stepped forward. One by one, they received their boxes. Klaus watched their faces, looking for clues, for any hint of what was real and what was theatre. Some men accepted the parcels with stiff formality, a curt nod, and nothing more. Others could not hide their emotion, their eyes widening, their hands trembling as they cradled the boxes like precious cargo. Oberleutnant Klaus Hoffmann. His name. His turn. Klaus stepped forward on legs that felt suddenly unsteady. The American guard holding the parcels was young, maybe 19, with a farm boy's open face and a smile that seemed entirely too genuine for a man standing on the enemy side of a war. He handed Klaus a box wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "Here you go, sir," the kid said in English. Klaus did not speak English well, but he understood the tone. Polite, almost cheerful. As though this were the most ordinary transaction in the world. Klaus took the box. It was heavier than he expected, solid and real in his hands. He nodded once, unable to speak, and stepped back into the crowd. Werner appeared beside him, his own parcel clutched against his chest. They did not speak. There were no words for this moment, for the collision of expectation and reality that was happening in the space between their hands and their hearts. When every prisoner had received a parcel, the sergeant dismissed them. "Enjoy," he said simply, and turned away to help reload the empty crates onto the truck. Klaus walked back to his barracks in silence. Behind him, he heard the murmur of voices rising, excitement and disbelief mixing into a sound that was almost like joy. He pushed through the door into the dim interior of the barracks, found his bunk, and sat down with the parcel in his lap. The other men in his room were already there, their parcels arranged before them like sacred objects. No one had opened theirs yet. They sat in a circle, staring at the boxes, and Klaus realized they were afraid. Afraid that opening them would break the spell, would reveal that this was all an elaborate hoax, that inside would be nothing but sawdust and stones and American laughter echoing from beyond the wire. Werner broke the silence. His voice was rough, almost angry. "Well," he said, "let us see what the Americans think we deserve." The knot came undone easily, and the brown paper fell away to reveal a cardboard box printed with English words Klaus could not read. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Werner opened the box slowly, carefully, as though it might explode. Then he stopped. His hands froze. His face went blank. "Werner?" Klaus asked. "What is it?" The old pilot did not answer. Instead, he reached into the box and pulled out a can. It was labeled in English, but Klaus could see the picture on the front. Meat. Spam, the Americans called it. Werner set it down gently, reverently, and reached in again. Coffee, powdered milk, sugar, raisins, chocolate bars, dark and glossy in their wrappers, cigarettes in paper packs, 5 of them, soap, a can of salmon, crackers, jam. Werner laid each item out on his bunk, arranging them in neat rows, and when he was finished he simply sat there, staring at the bounty before him. His shoulders began to shake. Klaus thought at first that he was laughing, but then he saw the tears on Werner's weathered face, silent and unstoppable. "They gave us food," Werner whispered. "Real food. They did not have to. They owe us nothing. We bombed their cities, killed their pilots, destroyed their bombers, and they gave us food." Klaus opened his own parcel with hands that would not stop shaking. Inside was the same miracle, the same impossible abundance. He took out one of the chocolate bars and held it up to the light. The wrapper was red and white, printed with the words, "Hershey's Milk Chocolate." He had not tasted chocolate in 3 years. He had almost forgotten what it was supposed to taste like. Around him, the other men were opening their parcels, their voices rising in a mixture of tastes, amazement and grief. Friedrich was laughing and crying at the same time, holding a can of peaches like it was made of gold. Otto had his face buried in his hands, his shoulders heaving with sobs he could not contain. Klaus unwrapped the chocolate bar. He broke off a single square and placed it in his mouth. The sweetness hit him like a physical blow, so intense it was almost painful. He closed his eyes and let it melt on his tongue, and in that moment, everything he had believed about the enemy, about the war, about the righteousness of the Reich, began to crack like ice under spring sun. Because this was not manipulation, this was not propaganda, this was just kindness, simple and inexplicable and terrifying in its implications. The Americans had nothing to gain from this act. They had already won. Germany was crumbling, the war was lost, every pilot in this camp knew it, even if they would not say it aloud. The Americans could have let them starve, they could have fed them sawdust, until the end came. Instead, they had given chocolate and coffee and the kind of abundance that Germany had promised its people and never delivered. Klaus thought of Goebbels, standing before microphones in Berlin, his voice crackling through radio speakers across the Reich. "The Americans are barbarians," Goebbels had said. "They have no culture, no honor, no soul. They are a nation of merchants and cowards who cannot understand sacrifice." But here, in his hands, was proof of something else. Here was a can of Spam and a bar of chocolate that said more than 1,000 speeches ever could. The Americans had sacrificed nothing to give him this food. They had simply produced it, packaged it, shipped it across an ocean and a continent, and handed it out to men who had tried to kill them. Not because they were weak, but because they were strong enough not to care about revenge. That night, the prisoners of Stalag Luft Three held an impromptu feast. They pooled their parcels in the prisoners' communal kitchen, combining American canned meat with German bread, mixing powdered milk with their ersatz coffee, sharing out chocolate squares and cigarettes with the solemnity of communion. The room filled with the smell of cooking food, real food, and for a few hours the war outside the wire faded into irrelevance. Klaus sat at a long wooden table, eating salmon from a can and crackers spread with jam, and listened to the conversations around him. Men who had not smiled in months were smiling now. Men who had given up hope were making plans again, talking about what they would do when they went home, how they would rebuild, what Germany might become after the madness ended. Werner sat across from him, smoking an American cigarette with the careful appreciation of a man who knew this luxury might not last. He caught Klaus's eye and shook his head slowly. "I was wrong," he said quietly. "About the Americans. About all of it." He took a long drag and exhaled smoke toward the ceiling. We were told they were animals, that they would torture us, starve us, mock us. And instead, he gestured at the food, the cigarettes, the simple fact of their survival. Instead, they treat us better than our own country ever did. Klaus wanted to argue, wanted to defend the Reich, wanted to believe that this was all just an elaborate American trick, but the chocolate had been real, the coffee had been real, the salmon and the crackers and the soap had been real, and if those things were real, then what else had been a lie? He did not sleep that night. He lay on his bunk, his stomach full for the first time in months, and stared at the darkness above him. In his mind, he replayed every briefing, every propaganda film, every speech about German superiority and American barbarism. He thought about the young intelligence officer in Dusseldorf, so confident in his lies. He thought about Goebbels and his radio broadcasts, his promises of final victory, and his warnings about the savage enemy. And he thought about the American farm boy who had handed him a box of food with a smile and called him Sir. The parcels kept coming. Every week through that bitter winter, the Red Cross truck would roll through the gates of Stalag Luft Three. Every week, the prisoners would line up to receive their boxes. And every week, the cognitive dissonance grew stronger, the gap between what they had been taught and what they were experiencing, widening into a chasm that could no longer be ignored. By January of 1945, the routine had become almost normal. Klaus and his roommates had developed a system. They would pool their parcels, combining the contents to create meals that approached something like pre-war standards. Otto, who had worked in a restaurant before the war, became their unofficial cook, mixing American canned goods with German rations to produce dishes that sometimes even had flavor. Friedrich, the young pilot who had cried over his first parcel, now traded cigarettes with German guards to obtain extra vegetables from local farms. Werner, the old cynic who had once dismissed the parcels as propaganda, now organized communal dinners with the precision of a military operation. The transformation was not just physical, though that was dramatic enough. Men who had been skeletal in December were filling out again by February. Faces that had been hollow and grey now showed hints of colour. The camp doctor, a German Luftwaffe physician named Müller, reported that cases of malnutrition had dropped by 70%. Men who had been too weak to walk across the compound now played football in the yard. The Red Cross parcels, he told Klaus one afternoon, had probably saved at least a dozen lives, but the deeper transformation was psychological. Klaus saw it in the way men talked about the enemy now, the way their voices changed when they spoke of Americans. The old certainties were crumbling, the propaganda narratives that had seemed so solid, so unquestionable, were dissolving in the face of chocolate bars and canned meat. "They do not need to do this," Friedrich said one evening as they sat around their makeshift dinner table. "They have already won. Germany is finished. We all know it, even if no one will say it out loud. So why feed us? Why waste resources on prisoners who can never threaten them again?" Otto stirred a pot of soup made from American canned vegetables and German potatoes. "Maybe that is the point," he said quietly. "Maybe they do it because they can, because they have so much that even their enemies are not worth hating." Werner lit one of his American cigarettes, the smoke curling up toward the barracks ceiling. "Or maybe," he said, "they do it because they believe in something we were taught to mock: rules, conventions, the idea that even in war, there are limits to cruelty." He exhaled slowly. The Geneva Convention was not propaganda, it was real. And the Americans are following it, even when we did not. Klaus said nothing. He was thinking about a conversation he had overheard 2 weeks ago, between an American guard and one of the German camp administrators. The American had been complaining about paperwork, about the bureaucratic nightmare of tracking parcels and maintaining records. "I did not join the army to be a mailman," he had grumbled. And the German administrator had laughed and replied, "But you do it anyway." "Yes," the American had said, "because it is the right thing to do." The right thing to do. Such a simple phrase, but it carried implications that terrified Klaus. Because if feeding enemy prisoners was the right thing to do, if following rules even when your enemy did not was the right thing to do, Then what did that say about Germany? What did it say about a regime that had built its power on the idea that might made right, that the strong owed nothing to the weak, that mercy was weakness and cruelty was strength? One night in late January, Klaus found Werner, sitting alone outside the barracks, smoking in the darkness despite the bitter cold. Klaus sat down beside him without speaking. They watched the searchlights sweep across the compound, methodical and indifferent. "I think about my son," Werner said finally. "He will be 18 next month, old enough for the Volkssturm, if Berlin has not fallen by then." He took a drag from his cigarette. "I pray he does not fight. I pray he has the sense to run, to hide, to survive. Because this war is not worth dying for, Klaus. It never was." Klaus heard the heresy in those words, the kind of defeatism that could get a man shot in Germany. But here, behind the wire, it was just truth. "You fought," Klaus said, "for years. You believed." "I believed what I was told to believe," Werner replied. "We all did. The propaganda was so complete, so total, that questioning it felt like questioning gravity. But now—" He gestured toward the barracks, toward the evidence of American abundance that surrounded them. "Now I see what we were fighting against. Not barbarians, not chaos, just a different way of being human. And maybe, Klaus, maybe their way was better." The words hung in the cold air between them. Klaus wanted to argue, wanted to defend something, anything, from the wreckage of his beliefs. But what could he say? That Germany had been right to start a war of conquest? That the Reich's promises justified the oceans of blood? That the Americans were secretly cruel, and their kindness was just a mask? "What will you tell your son?" Klaus asked. "When the war is over? When you go home?" "That I was wrong, that we were all wrong, that the men we called barbarians showed us more mercy than we deserved." He dropped his cigarette and crushed it under his boot. "And I will tell him to be better than we were. To question everything, to never follow orders blindly, to remember that kindness is not weakness." Slowly, he thought about his own family, his mother and sister in Stuttgart. He had not heard from them in months. The mail had stopped coming in November. He did not know if they were alive, if the bombs had spared them, if they had food or heat or hope. But he knew that when he finally went home, if he went home, he would carry these lessons with him. February brought news that changed everything. The guards were unusually tense, their faces grim as they conducted roll call. The camp interpreter made an announcement that sent ripples of shock through the assembled prisoners. The Red Army was advancing west, rapidly. The camp might need to be evacuated. The uncertainty bred fear. For weeks, the camp had been a kind of limbo, uncomfortable but stable. Now that stability was fragmenting, the Red Cross parcels kept coming, even as rumors swirled about evacuation. Klaus found dark humor in that continuity. The world was ending, and yet the bureaucratic machinery of the International Red cross-ground on, delivering chocolate bars with the same indifference as the mail. In the end, the evacuation never came. The camp commandant, Oberst Braun, negotiated with the advancing Allied forces. Rather than force thousands of prisoners into a death march through winter snow, he simply waited. On May 2nd, 1945, Soviet soldiers appeared at the gates of Stalag Luft Three. The German guards laid down their weapons. The war, at least for the prisoners, was over. They released Klaus in late June of 1945. He was given civilian clothes, a small amount of German marks that were probably worthless, and papers certifying he had been a prisoner of war. Then they put him on a train heading west, into what was left of Germany. The journey took 3 days. The train moved slowly through a landscape that Klaus barely recognized. Cities were ruins, great piles of rubble where buildings had once stood. Bridges were collapsed, fields were cratered and burned. And, everywhere there were people, refugees moving in long columns, carrying what little they had salvaged, looking for homes that no longer existed. Stuttgart was worse than he had imagined. The city centre was gone, simply gone, replaced by a wasteland of broken brick and twisted steel. The cathedral, where he had been confirmed, stood roofless and skeletal. The bakery where his father had worked was a crater. The apartment building where he had grown up was a facade with nothing behind it. He found his mother and sister living in the cellar of what had once been a department store, sharing the space with a dozen other families. They had survived on rations and black market food, on handouts from the occupying American forces. When his mother saw him, she cried, not with joy, though there was joy in it, but with relief so profound it was almost grief. They sat together that first night, sharing a meal of American Army rations that his mother had saved for a special occasion. Canned beans, and hard crackers and ersatz coffee. Klaus told them about the camp, about the Red Cross parcels, about the American guards who had smiled and called him sir. "They gave you chocolate?" his mother asked finally, her voice carrying disbelief. "Every week," Klaus said. "Sometimes twice a week. Chocolate, coffee, meat, cigarettes, everything we needed." His sister, 19 and thin as paper, laughed bitterly. "We were told the Americans were starving their prisoners. That captured Germans were dying in camps. Goebbels said it on the radio, before the radio stopped working." Klaus thought about Werner's words. They believed what they were told to believe. How many other lies had they been told? How many other truths had been buried? "The Americans followed the Geneva Convention," Klaus said quietly. "They treated us according to the rules. Better than the rules sometimes. They did not have to be kind, but they were." His mother was silent for a long moment. Then she reached across and took his hand. "I am glad," she said. "I am glad they were kind to you. I am glad you are home." She squeezed tightly. "Now we rebuild. All of us. We have to learn to live without the lies." Klaus carried his Red Cross parcel experience with him through the long years of Germany's reconstruction. He found work as a mechanic, his Luftwaffe training translating into skills that were valuable in a nation desperate to rebuild. He married his sister's friend Anna, a teacher who had survived the war by sheer luck. They had 3 children, and Klaus told them stories about the war that were honest in a way that earlier generations' stories had not been. He told them about the propaganda that had shaped his youth, the lies that had seemed like truth, the certainties that had crumbled in the face of evidence. And he told them about the chocolate bar, the one moment when everything he believed had been challenged by a simple act of human decency. "The Americans had every reason to hate us," he told his oldest son when the boy was 16. "We had bombed their allies, killed their pilots. They won. They had the power to do whatever they wanted to us. They could have starved us, beaten us, left us to die, and instead they sent us parcels." "Why?" his son asked. "Why would they do that?" Klaus thought about that question. "Because they believed in something bigger than revenge," he said finally. "They believed that even enemies deserve dignity, that even in war there are rules that matter. And by following those rules, by showing us that mercy was not weakness, they taught us more than any bomb or bullet ever could." Klaus Hoffmann died in 1992, an old man in a reunified Germany that bore little resemblance to the Reich of his youth. In his final years, he had become something of a local historian, giving talks to school groups about the war, about the dangers of propaganda, about the importance of questioning authority. He always brought with him a faded, chocolate wrapper, red and white and barely legible, preserved in a plastic sleeve like a holy relic. "This is what changed my life," he would tell the students. "Not a bullet, not a bomb, but a simple gift from the enemy. It taught me that the world is more complicated than we are told, that people are capable of both great cruelty and great kindness, and that the choice between them is what defines us." After his death, his family donated his papers to a war museum in Berlin. Among them was a journal he had kept during his months in Stalag Luft Three. One entry, dated January 15, 1945, read, "Today I received my 5th Red Cross parcel. Inside was a small bar of soap, American soap, clean and white and perfumed. I held it for a long time. This soap represents the belief that even prisoners deserve dignity, that we are still human, still worthy of basic care, even though we tried to kill them. I do not know how to reconcile this with everything I was taught. But I know this. I will never forget this soap. The people I was told to hate showed me unexpected mercy. The Red Cross parcels sent to Stalag Luft Three were part of a massive humanitarian operation that spanned the entire war. From 1943 to 1945, the American Red Cross alone assembled and shipped 27 million parcels to prisoners of war around the world. Each parcel represented an investment of labor and resources, volunteers working in packing centers in Philadelphia and Chicago and St. Louis. Donations collected from citizens, food purchased and packaged, and transported across oceans and continents. The operation was not perfect. Parcels were delayed by bombed rail lines, stolen by desperate guards, lost in the chaos of retreating armies. Not every prisoner received their full allotment. Not every camp had equal access, but the sheer scale of the effort, the commitment to following the Geneva Convention, even when it would have been easier not to, represented something profound about Allied values. For the German pilots who received those parcels, the impact was incalculable. Some, like Klaus, had their worldview shattered by the experience. Others remained true believers until the end. But for most, the parcels planted seeds of doubt that would grow in the post-war years, contributing to a generation's rejection of Nazi ideology and embrace of democratic values. The parcels also saved lives. Medical studies done after the war showed that POW camps with regular Red Cross deliveries had dramatically lower mortality rates than camps without them. In Stalag Luft Three, the camp doctor estimated that the parcels had prevented at least 20 deaths during the winter of 44 to 45. But beyond the physical sustenance, the parcels provided something less tangible but equally vital. They provided hope. They provided proof that the outside world had not forgotten. They provided evidence that humanity could survive even in the machinery of war. The story of Stalag Luft Three is not the story of great battles or strategic victories. It is about the small moments, the individual encounters, the unexpected kindnesses that accumulate into something larger than themselves. It is about 800 German pilots who expected cruelty and found decency, who were prepared for barbarism and encountered bureaucratic fairness, who believed the lies they had been told until the truth arrived in a cardboard box wrapped in brown paper. And it is about the Americans who, having every reason to hate, chose instead to follow rules. Who proved that strength and mercy were not opposites but complements? Who showed that even in the darkest chapter of the 20th century, humanity could survive if people worked to preserve it? Klaus Hoffmann's story is just one among thousands. Thousands of German soldiers who surrendered and expected death but found life. Thousands of small moments when the enemy proved more human than the propaganda claimed. Thousands of chocolate bars and cans of Spam that said, more clearly than any speech or treaty, that another way was possible. The lesson survives. In museums and memorials, in family stories and historical records, in the memories of those who lived through those years and the education of those who came after. The lesson that hate is easy, but mercy is strong. That propaganda crumbles before evidence. That even in the machinery of war, individual choices matter. That kindness, unexpected and undeserved, can change the world. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.